In the heart of Manchester's quiet suburbs, a respected lawyer's perfect life shattered in one horrifying night. What drove Christopher Lumsden, a man of intellect, control, and success, to murder his wife in cold blood? Behind closed doors lay secrets, silence, and a mind on the edge. This is their haunting story. It was the kind of evening that settles quietly over suburban Manchester. Cold, still, and uneventful. The houses of Altrincham, with their trimmed hedges and soft golden lights, spoke of comfort and control. But inside one of those homes, the Lumsden household, something had been slowly breaking for years. What unfolded that February night in 2006 would shatter not just a family, but also the image of perfection they had so carefully built. Christopher Lumsden had always been seen as a man of stature. A corporate lawyer, sharply dressed, articulate, and admired in professional circles. He represented everything that success was supposed to look like. To his colleagues, he was disciplined and intelligent, the kind of man who thrived under pressure. But those who knew him more intimately could sense a quiet fracture behind his calm exterior. Work had become an endless treadmill, and the emotional toll of his collapsing marriage weighed heavily on him. Friends noticed the changes. His once confident voice grew hesitant. His eyes seemed tired, distant. But no one imagined that beneath that surface was a man nearing the edge of psychological collapse. Alison Lumsden, his wife of over 20 years, was the opposite in many ways, warm, open, and deeply social. She had friends everywhere, a natural charm that drew people to her. Those who met her often said she was the heart of any gathering, always smiling, always in control. But behind closed doors, her life was far from calm. The Lumsdens' marriage had become a storm of unspoken resentments and emotional distance. Arguments were common, though rarely violent. Alison had grown weary of Christopher's detachment, and Christopher had grown increasingly resentful of her criticisms. Both had become prisoners of their own unhappiness, trapped in a home filled with tension and silence. In the weeks leading up to that February evening, things had reached a breaking point. Christopher's work was overwhelming, and he had started showing signs of depression. He withdrew from friends, spent long hours at the office, and barely spoke at home. Alison, feeling neglected and angry, began spending more time away, confiding in friends about her frustration. Those close to her later said she was considering separation, though she hadn't yet made up her mind. On the night of February 18, 2006, the quiet of the Lumsden home was broken by raised voices. Neighbors later told police they heard muffled shouting. Nothing unusual, they said, just another argument. Inside, Alison confronted Christopher about his behavior, accusing him of emotional cruelty and distance. Christopher, exhausted and fragile, snapped. The argument spiraled, words turning to shouting, anger turning to desperation. Alison reportedly tried to walk away, but in that moment, something inside Christopher broke completely. In the kitchen, a knife gleamed under the light. He reached for it, perhaps out of impulse, perhaps in a blur of confusion, and within seconds the argument had turned fatal. The sound of struggle echoed briefly through the house, then silence. When it was over, Alison lay motionless on the floor, fatally wounded. Blood spread across the tiles as Christopher stood frozen, the reality of what he had done sinking in like ice. When the police arrived, responding to a frantic emergency call from a neighbor who heard the noise, they found Christopher standing in shock beside his wife's body. His hands were trembling, his eyes unfocused. "I didn't mean to. I lost control," he whispered. Officers would later describe him as pale, disoriented, almost detached from reality. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't even ask what would happen next. Word spread quickly through Manchester's legal community. The news that one of their own, a respected lawyer, had been charged with killing his wife sent ripples of disbelief. Colleagues refused to believe it at first. To them, Christopher had always seemed rational, calm, even gentle. How could a man who spent his career navigating the law's complexities now stand accused of breaking it in the most horrific way possible? In the hours that followed, investigators began piecing together the fragments of the Lumsdens' life. Friends described a once-loving marriage that had deteriorated beyond repair. Allison's closest confidants spoke of her sadness, her loneliness, her growing fear that Christopher's emotional instability might one day erupt. There were no prior reports of violence, but the tension was well known. Their children, both adults, were devastated. They had sensed something was wrong, but never imagined it would end like this. During questioning, Christopher's behavior was erratic. He seemed distant, remorseful, yet confused. Detectives noted his emotional state and later ordered a psychological evaluation. What emerged was a picture of a man who had been unraveling quietly under pressure. A man consumed by depression and exhaustion, who had lost all sense of control. He spoke of feeling trapped, of sleepless nights filled with arguments in his head, of fear that everything he had built was slipping away. The case was never going to be simple. From the beginning, it blurred the line between tragedy and crime. Was this a cold-blooded act of violence, or the breaking point of a man in psychological collapse? The prosecution would later argue one side, the defense the other. But for now, as Christopher sat alone in his holding cell that night, the only sound was his own voice, soft, broken, repeating the same words he had said to the police. "I didn't mean to. I lost control." Outside the Lumsden home, police tape fluttered in the wind. Neighbors stood in silence, their faces pale in the glow of streetlights. The image of that elegant home, once a symbol of success and respectability, was now a scene of unspeakable tragedy. Reporters gathered, flashes from cameras illuminating the darkness, while investigators carried evidence bags from the house. What had once looked like the perfect life, a successful lawyer, a loving wife, a comfortable home, was now a headline. Lawyer kills wife in domestic dispute. But the story behind that headline was more complicated than anyone realized. It was not just about violence. It was about pressure, mental illness, and a marriage quietly collapsing under the weight of years of silence. In the coming days, Manchester would be consumed by questions. How could a man who spent his life in control lose it so completely? What had really happened inside that house before the knife was drawn? And what drove Christopher Lumsden, a man of intellect and reason, to the point of no return? As dawn broke over Altrincham, the answers were still hidden within the walls of that elegant home, where love had turned into tragedy, and a lifetime of respect had been destroyed in a single, irreversible moment. The morning after the killing, Manchester woke to headlines that seemed almost impossible to believe. A respected lawyer, a man of reputation and intellect, accused of killing his wife in their home. The story dominated the news, drawing both shock and fascination. How could someone who had built a career defending justice commit such a crime? In the days that followed, police began to unravel the emotional web that had led to that night, an unraveling that exposed the darker truths of Christopher and Allison Lumsden's marriage. The investigation began with careful precision. Detectives scoured the Lumsden home for evidence. Photographs were taken, fingerprints lifted, blood patterns analyzed. Forensic teams documented every inch of the kitchen, where the confrontation had turned deadly. The knife was recovered near Allison's body, a silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded. The medical examiner later confirmed that she had been stabbed multiple times, each wound consistent with sudden, uncontrolled violence. But what disturbed investigators most was the absence of any attempt to flee. Christopher had stayed by her side until help arrived. That decision, they believed, said more about his mental state than his guilt. As police questioned neighbors and friends, a more complete picture emerged. The Lumsdens had been living separate emotional lives for years. Friends of Allison described her as lonely, often confiding that she felt trapped in a marriage that no longer brought her peace. She had once told a close friend, "I don't know who he is anymore. He looks at me like I'm a stranger." Others recalled her saying she wanted to leave, but wasn't sure how to begin again after so many years. Christopher, on the other hand, had been described by colleagues as withdrawn and erratic in the months leading up to the incident. His work had begun to suffer, and he often left the office early, citing headaches or fatigue. Those who had admired him began to notice that he was slipping away from himself. When Christopher was formally charged, His demeanor in court was eerily calm. Dressed neatly, he spoke softly, answering only when addressed. Reporters described him as a man in quiet collapse. Detached, but aware. He didn't deny what he had done. Instead, his legal team prepared to build a defense around his deteriorating mental health. It wasn't a strategy of evasion but of explanation. They claimed he had not intended to kill Allison, that his actions were the result of a psychological breakdown brought on by depression, exhaustion, and emotional turmoil. Before the trial began, psychiatrists were brought in to examine him. Their reports painted a portrait of a man consumed by despair. They described symptoms of severe depression and something known as an adjustment disorder, a condition that occurs when emotional stress becomes too overwhelming to manage. Christopher's world, they explained, had been closing in on him. A failing marriage, professional pressure, and a gnawing sense of inadequacy that ate away at his confidence. In their assessment, he had reached a point of total collapse. The night of the killing, they argued, was not an act of deliberate cruelty but a moment of complete psychological disintegration. Meanwhile, Allison's family struggled to make sense of their grief. Her sister, speaking to reporters outside court, said softly, "She was a kind soul. She didn't deserve this. No one does." Her words echoed through the press coverage, reminding everyone that behind the legal arguments and psychological assessments, there was a woman who had lost her life and a family shattered by loss. As the trial began at Manchester Crown Court, the courtroom filled with a mix of curiosity and sorrow. Journalists, law students, and everyday citizens packed the seats. The irony of a lawyer standing trial for his wife's killing was not lost on anyone. The prosecution presented their case first, arguing that Christopher's actions were deliberate. They painted a picture of a man who had grown controlling, frustrated by his wife's independence and their deteriorating marriage. They told the jury that this was not a momentary lapse but a release of long-suppressed anger. The evidence, they said, was in the repeated blows, the weapon chosen, and the finality of the act. But when the defense took the floor, the tone shifted dramatically. They called psychiatrists, family members, and colleagues to testify about Christopher's mental state. His defense lawyer described a man who had given everything to his career, only to find himself hollowed out by emotional exhaustion. "This was not a monster," the lawyer said. "This was a man who broke under pressure." Expert witnesses supported that claim, explaining that Christopher's ability to think rationally had been impaired. His mind, they said, was in a state of chaos, a fog of despair that had blurred the line between thought and impulse. Medical records confirmed he had been prescribed antidepressants and had seen a therapist shortly before the killing. The defense argued that his mental illness had diminished his responsibility, transforming what might seem like murder into manslaughter. Throughout the proceedings, Christopher sat motionless, often staring at the floor. When asked to describe his feelings, he said only, "I wish I could undo it. I loved her." It was the first time he had spoken publicly about the night. His voice trembled, and for a moment, even the prosecution paused. It was hard to reconcile this broken figure with the man who had once commanded respect in courtrooms across Manchester. As the trial neared its end, the jury was faced with an impossible question. Was Christopher Lumsden a cold-blooded killer, or a man who had lost his grip on reality? Both sides had made compelling arguments. The prosecution demanded justice for Allison, emphasizing the brutality of her death. The defense pleaded for understanding, urging the jury to see Christopher as a man undone by his own mind. Outside the courthouse, the public debate was equally divided. Some believed that wealth and status had given Christopher an unfair advantage. Others felt sympathy, seeing in him a tragic reminder of how mental illness can destroy even the most controlled lives. After days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. The courtroom was silent as the judge announced the sentence: 5 years in prison. Christopher nodded faintly, showing no visible reaction. To some, it was a merciful decision. To others, it was a scandalous leniency. For Allison's family, the verdict offered little comfort. No amount of explanation could bring her back. For Christopher, The prison sentence marked the beginning of a different kind of punishment, the lifelong weight of guilt. And for the public, the Lumsden case became a haunting example of how even the brightest minds can be consumed by darkness. In the following months, newspapers continued to debate the case. Some saw it as an indictment of privilege, others as a call to recognize the devastating effects of untreated mental illness. But for those who had known the couple, the story was simpler. It was about two people who once loved each other deeply, who lost their way, and whose lives ended in tragedy. The courtroom had delivered its verdict, but the true reckoning was far more complex. Behind the headlines and the legal arguments was a question that lingered long after the trial was over. How could a man so devoted to justice lose his own sense of it in a single, irreversible moment? In the months that followed the verdict, the story of Christopher and Allison Lumsden began to fade from the headlines. But for those whose lives it had touched, the echoes lingered. Behind prison walls, Christopher began his slow reckoning with what he had done. Gone was the sharp-suited lawyer who once argued with precision and confidence in Manchester's courts. Now he was simply another inmate, confined by steel bars and haunted by memory. The silence of his cell became a cruel mirror, reflecting the reality he could no longer escape. Every day began the same way, early morning light filtering through the small window, a reminder that the world outside continued without him. According to those who saw him in prison, Christopher was a man hollowed out by guilt. He avoided conversation, spent hours reading, and rarely slept through the night. The staff described him as polite but distant, a man who carried an invisible burden. Some inmates reportedly mocked him at first, the posh lawyer who killed his wife. But soon even they left him alone. There was something about his quiet remorse that made cruelty unnecessary. He wasn't defiant or defensive. He was broken. When asked by a prison psychologist if he hated himself for what he had done, his answer was quiet and simple: every day. While Christopher served his sentence, Allison's family tried to rebuild their lives. Her sister and friends organized memorial events in her honor. Small gatherings filled with flowers, photographs, and stories that reminded everyone who she truly was. Allison's children, caught between grief and confusion, struggled to reconcile their love for both parents. In interviews years later, one of them said, "I lost both of them that night. One died, and the other disappeared." Their pain was shared by many who followed the case, because it spoke to something deeper than crime. It spoke to the human cost of emotional collapse, the way love can curdle into tragedy when communication and understanding vanish. Inside the prison, Christopher began therapy. Sessions were long and difficult. His psychologist later described him as a man trapped in endless self-reflection, desperate for forgiveness but unable to grant it to himself. He spoke often of Allison, of their early years together. University days, laughter in their first apartment, quiet mornings before children and work consumed their lives. The more he remembered, the heavier his regret became. He never denied his guilt, but he also struggled to understand how he had become the man capable of such an act. "It wasn't me," he once said in a recorded session. "It was the version of me that stopped caring if he lived or died." Meanwhile, the case continued to be studied in legal and psychological circles. Law students debated whether the verdict was fair. Some saw it as a compassionate acknowledgement of mental illness. Others saw it as a troubling sign of inequality in justice. If Christopher Lumsden had been an ordinary man without status or education, would the court have been as lenient? The question divided opinion. Yet beyond the legal arguments lay the undeniable truth that mental health had played a central role in this tragedy. Experts cited the case in lectures and journals, using it to highlight the dangerous intersection of emotional suppression, professional pressure, and untreated depression. When Christopher was finally released from prison after serving part of his sentence, he did so quietly. There were no reporters waiting, no public statements. He returned to a world that had moved on, one that had little place for him. Disbarred from legal practice and estranged from much of his family, he lived a private life, reportedly moving to a small village outside Manchester. Those who encountered him described a man who rarely spoke, who kept to himself, and who seemed forever shadowed by remorse. For Allison's family, his release reopened old wounds. Her sister told a local paper, "It's hard to know how to feel. Nothing can bring her back, but it hurts to think he's free while she's gone." Yet even within their anger, there was a quiet acceptance that justice could never truly balance what had been lost. Time would pass, but the scar would remain. Years later, the Lumsden case became the subject of documentaries and true crime discussions. The story was retold not as one of sensational violence, but as a study in human fragility. Viewers were reminded that beneath professional success and social grace, there can lie deep, unspoken suffering. The narrative often returned to that fateful night in February 2006, but just as often, it lingered on the years before. The quiet distance between husband and wife, the ignored signs of mental decline, the silence that slowly replaced understanding. It was a tragedy years in the making, not a single act of rage. In interviews with people who had once known the couple, a recurring theme emerged: the illusion of perfection. Friends admitted they had envied the Lumsdens, their home, their careers, their composed appearance. But no one had seen the cracks until it was too late. Their story became a cautionary tale about how easily people can hide their pain behind a facade of success, how easily love can turn to resentment when empathy fades. Doesn't always wear a monstrous face. It can look ordinary, even respectable. In his later years, Christopher lived quietly, away from the public eye. It was said he spent much of his time volunteering, perhaps in an attempt to make peace with himself. No public record confirms how his life ended, but those who knew the story say he never escaped the shadow of that night. His name would always be tied to the crime that destroyed both his and Allison's lives. The Lumsden case remains one of Manchester's most haunting domestic tragedies, not because of its brutality, but because of its ordinariness. It was not a story of greed or revenge, but of emotional collapse, of two people lost in silence until it consumed them. It forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about mental health, about the expectations placed on men to suppress emotion, and about how easily a lifetime of composure can crumble in a single moment. In the end, Christopher Lumsden's story is not one of redemption, nor of justice fulfilled. It is a story of consequence, of what happens when pain goes unspoken, when pressure builds unchecked, and when love becomes something sharp enough to destroy. The elegant home in Altrincham, once a symbol of success, stands now only as a quiet reminder of how fragile human lives truly are. Behind closed doors, where laughter once echoed, tragedy found its voice. And long after the lights faded, the story of Christopher and Allison Lumsden remained, a chilling testament to how even the most perfect lives can fracture beyond repair. In the heart of Melbourne's underworld, one brilliant lawyer played both sides, defending criminals by day and betraying them by night. What began as a quest for justice spiraled into the biggest legal scandal in Australian history. This is the shocking true story of Lawyer X, Nicola Gobbo. In the heart of Melbourne's legal world, where reputation and integrity were considered sacred, one woman's ambition and double life would unravel the very foundations of justice. Nicola Gobbo was a name that commanded respect in courtrooms across Victoria. Brilliant, eloquent, and unafraid to take on the toughest cases, she had built her career defending some of Australia's most notorious underworld figures. Yet behind the confident smile and polished legal arguments, Gobbo was living a secret that would one day explode into one of the biggest scandals in Australian legal history, the Lawyer X affair. The early 2000s were a turbulent time in Melbourne. The city was in the grip of a bloody gangland war, a decade-long conflict between rival criminal factions fighting for dominance in the drug trade. The violence was relentless. Car bombings, drive-by shootings, and cold-blooded assassinations turned once quiet streets into war zones. The police, desperate to regain control, launched specialized units such as the Purana Task Force to dismantle organized crime networks. It was in this tense and chaotic environment that Nicola Gobbo's career flourished. She became a go-to defense lawyer for some of the most dangerous men in Australia. Gobbo's connection to the criminal underworld wasn't accidental. Charismatic and sharp, she moved effortlessly between two worlds, the clean, procedural world of the courts and the dark, unpredictable realm of Melbourne's crime scene. Among her clients were high-profile figures like Tony Mockbell, a drug kingpin who built an empire supplying amphetamines and cocaine across the country, and Carl Williams, a notorious gangland boss responsible for multiple murders. To them, Gobo was more than a lawyer. She was an ally, a confidant, someone who understood the game and played it well. Her loyalty seemed unquestionable. But behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. Victoria Police had long struggled to infiltrate the criminal networks that Gobo represented. They needed inside information, names, movements, deals, the inner workings of the underworld. When police approached Gobo, they found someone who was already disillusioned. She felt betrayed by parts of the legal system and overwhelmed by the moral weight of the cases she defended. Slowly, a dangerous relationship began to form. Nicola Gobo became Informer 3838, a secret police source providing confidential intelligence about her own clients. It was an extraordinary breach of ethics, the kind of betrayal that would one day shake the entire legal establishment. At first, Gobo justified her cooperation with police as a necessary evil. She told herself she was helping to prevent violence, saving lives by assisting law enforcement to bring down dangerous criminals. Police handlers from the Piranha Task Force reassured her, promising that her identity would remain forever hidden. Her information was invaluable. She knew the networks, the safe houses, the drug routes, and the key players' secrets. She was feeding the police evidence that helped dismantle major criminal operations, all while standing in court defending the very people she was betraying. Inside her mind, two worlds constantly clashed. In the courtroom, she fought fiercely for her clients, speaking with conviction about justice and fairness. But in private meetings, she passed along the same information she vowed to protect. Every call, every file, every whisper she shared with police deepened her involvement and made her escape impossible. The police, thrilled by the quality of intelligence she provided, grew increasingly dependent on her. They began pushing her boundaries, asking for more details about her clients' legal strategies, confidential documents, even privileged conversations. Gobo's fear of exposure grew, but by then, she was trapped in a web she had spun herself. Tony Mockbell, one of her primary clients, trusted her completely. To him, Nicola was not just a defense lawyer, she was a loyal friend. Mockbell's empire was vast and ruthless, built on greed and intimidation, and Gobo knew how to navigate his complex network. Her insights allowed police to anticipate his moves, intercept his operations, and eventually tighten the noose around him. As law enforcement closed in, Mockbell had no idea that the person who helped shape his legal defense was secretly working to destroy him. The Piranha Task Force saw Gobo as their secret weapon, the missing link in their battle against the gangland chaos. They documented her tips under code names and heavily redacted reports, ensuring her identity remained buried deep within police files. Yet, even within the force, some officers grew uneasy. They knew what they were doing crossed every ethical boundary. Using a defense lawyer as an informant was not only professionally reckless, it was legally explosive. But by then, the ends justified the means. As long as criminals were being arrested and convictions secured, the system looked the other way. Meanwhile, Gobo's life began to crumble under the weight of secrecy. She suffered sleepless nights, paranoia, and constant fear of being discovered. She recorded conversations, hid documents, and moved between safe houses, convinced that someone would find out. Her relationships deteriorated, and whispers began to circulate within the criminal community about her unusual closeness with certain officers. But the truth was still too extraordinary to believe. No one could imagine that one of Melbourne's most successful defense barristers was secretly undermining her own clients. By 2007, the lines between right and wrong had completely blurred. Gobo was supplying police with crucial information that led to arrests and major drug seizures. But every success for law enforcement meant another layer of corruption in the justice system. The police celebrated her contributions in secret briefings, calling her intelligence gold. While Gobo tried to convince herself she was still a good person doing the right thing. Yet deep down, she knew she was crossing an unreturnable line, betraying the very principles she had once sworn to uphold. Her dual life became increasingly unstable. Police pressured her to continue cooperating, reminding her of the dangers she faced if she stopped. Criminal clients demanded loyalty, unaware that she was the invisible hand guiding investigators closer to them. The tension was unbearable. Every trial she argued, every plea she negotiated, carried a risk that her betrayal would be exposed. The legal community saw her as a brilliant advocate, but in truth, Nicola Gobo was living on borrowed time, her every move shadowed by guilt and fear. As Melbourne's gangland war began to fade, Gobo's usefulness to police grew even more critical. She had become their most valuable informant but also their greatest liability. What neither she nor the police realized was that the secret they shared would not remain buried forever. The decisions made during those years would one day come back to haunt them all, exposing a scandal that would shake the public's faith in justice itself. And when the truth finally surfaced, Nicola Gobo's name would become synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in Australia's legal history. As the years unfolded, the hidden alliance between Nicola Gobo and Victoria Police grew more complicated and increasingly dangerous. What began as a secret arrangement based on mutual need had evolved into something far more destructive, a system of manipulation and exploitation that spiraled beyond anyone's control. By the late 2000s, Melbourne's gangland wars were winding down, and the Purana Task Force's victories were being celebrated publicly. Behind those headlines, however, lay a truth so deeply buried that even those closest to the investigations couldn't have imagined the scale of deceit that had been woven into the justice system. Nicola Gobo's life had become a paradox. On one side, she was a respected barrister defending high-profile clients in Melbourne's Supreme Court. On the other, she was a covert source listed in confidential police files as Informer 3838. Her double role was sustained by fear and coercion as much as by choice. The police handlers who had once courted her cooperation now controlled her through pressure and secrecy. They reminded her of the dangers she would face if her identity were ever revealed, warning that criminals like Tony Mockbell and Carl Williams would stop at nothing to silence her. Gobo was living on the edge of exposure, trapped between two powers, the criminals she defended and the police she served. Her relationship with the Purana Task Force grew increasingly transactional. They praised her bravery, offered reassurances, and occasionally promised protection, but every conversation came with a demand. They needed more intelligence, more documents, more privileged information about her clients. It was not enough for her to provide insight into underworld gossip. They wanted full access to defense strategies, private conversations, and the inner workings of criminal networks. Each time Gobo hesitated, she was reminded of the greater good, that her actions were helping save lives and dismantle dangerous organizations. It became the mantra she repeated to herself to justify the betrayal that haunted her every waking moment. The more she gave, the deeper she sank. Police officers treated her not as a respected lawyer but as a valuable asset, cataloged and controlled. They kept her code name confidential even from most of their own ranks, fearing that any leak could lead to catastrophe. But the weight of their secrecy was crushing her. Gobo began documenting her own interactions, secretly recording conversations and writing detailed notes, perhaps sensing that one day she might need to protect herself. The recordings painted a chilling picture of how far the police were willing to go to extract what they wanted from her. Meanwhile, her personal life was unraveling. Sleep became rare. Paranoia consumed her. She feared being followed, feared that one of her clients would discover her secret. She moved homes frequently, severed friendships, and withdrew from colleagues who once admired her. The sharp, confident lawyer who once commanded courtrooms was now a woman living in shadows. Her sense of identity fractured. Was she a criminal lawyer, a police informant, or both? Each role contradicted the other, tearing at her conscience. Among her clients, Tony Mockbell remained the most significant. He was intelligent, cautious, and influential, running his drug empire with precision and control. Gobo knew his weaknesses and the legal loopholes he used to stay ahead of the system. To Victoria Police, that made her an invaluable weapon. Her insider information helped them map Mockbell's network, locate safe houses, and anticipate his movements. Eventually, in 2007, Mokbel fled Australia while facing serious drug charges, escaping to Greece under a false identity. When he was captured a year later, part of the intelligence that guided police to him could be traced back to Gobo's tips. For investigators, it was a triumph. For Gobo, it was another link in the chain that bound her to the police forever. Her dealings weren't limited to Mokbel. Gobo also provided intelligence on individuals linked to Carl Williams, the once feared gangland figure who had risen to infamy during Melbourne's violent underworld conflicts. Williams was serving a life sentence for multiple murders, but even from behind bars, he held influence over those still loyal to him. Gobo's relationship with members of his network gave police an advantage, one that blurred the boundaries of legitimate investigation and outright manipulation. Every time Gobo stepped into a cell to speak with a client, she was also carrying a hidden agenda. By 2010, cracks were beginning to appear in the facade. Some within Victoria Police expressed concern about the risks of continuing to use a defense lawyer as an informant. The ethical breach was monumental. Gobo's cooperation had compromised dozens of criminal cases, and the consequences, if revealed, could be catastrophic. Yet, instead of confronting the truth, the system concealed it. Internal reports were buried, code names replaced real ones, and files were classified under layers of secrecy. Protecting the institution became more important than protecting justice. When Carl Williams was murdered in prison in 2010, rumors began to circulate. Whispers in the underworld suggested that information leaks might have played a role in the tensions leading to his death. Gobo grew terrified, convinced that her secret dealings were on the verge of exposure. She distanced herself from her legal career, but the ghosts of her past refused to let her go. The police, equally fearful of what might happen if her identity became public, kept her close, assuring her she would always remain protected. But protection came at a cost. Complete isolation and the constant reminder that she could never return to her old life. Behind the scenes, journalists, lawyers, and even former officers began asking questions. How had police achieved so many successful convictions during the gangland wars? How had they obtained such precise intelligence? There were gaps that didn't add up, coincidences that seemed too perfect. Files went missing, documents were redacted, and legal experts began speculating that someone within the defense system might have been compromised. Still, the truth remained elusive. Nicola Gobo was deteriorating mentally and emotionally. The stress of years spent living a double life took its toll. In private, she began to lash out at the same police officers who once praised her. She accused them of using her, of destroying her career and her peace of mind. They, in turn, saw her as unstable, someone who might one day turn against them. It was a fragile alliance built on lies, fear, and mutual destruction. By the mid-2010s, as the gangland cases faded from public memory, Gobo was living in obscurity, consumed by paranoia and regret. She had helped the police bring down major criminal figures, but the price was her reputation, her career, and her safety. In a system that thrived on secrecy, she had become both a tool and a casualty. What neither she nor the police knew was that the very secrecy they relied on would soon become their undoing. The truth, buried for over a decade, was about to emerge, and when it did, it would send shockwaves through Australia's entire justice system. By 2018, the secret Nicola Gobo had spent years protecting finally began to unravel. It started quietly, a suppressed name, a leaked file, a hint in a journalist's report, but soon it erupted into a national scandal that shook Australia's justice system to its core. The truth was undeniable. One of Victoria's most prominent criminal defense barristers, the woman once trusted by some of the country's most dangerous men, had been working as a registered police informant. For years, she had betrayed her clients' confidences, supplied intelligence to Victoria Police, and played both sides of the law. The woman once praised for her brilliance in the courtroom was now at the center of one of the greatest breaches of legal ethics in Australian history. When the story first broke, the reaction was disbelief. The idea that a lawyer could secretly serve as a police source seemed almost impossible. But as the details emerged, the reality grew darker. Gobo's role as Informer 3838 had not been a brief lapse in judgment. It had spanned years, influencing dozens of cases. Her cooperation with the Purana task force had helped secure convictions, break up drug networks, and dismantle criminal empires, but at a devastating cost to the integrity of the justice system. Each victory she helped deliver to police was tainted by deception, built on privileged information that was never meant to leave the confines of the attorney-client relationship. The public revelation of her identity sent shockwaves through Melbourne's legal community. Judges, prosecutors, and defense lawyers all scrambled to assess the damage. If Gobo's information had influenced convictions, then how many of those cases were now unsafe? How many people had been imprisoned based on evidence that should never have existed? The answers were staggering. Within weeks, legal teams began filing appeals, demanding reviews of cases where Gobo had acted as counsel. The High Court of Australia intervened, describing the entire affair as a fundamental and appalling breach of the duties owed by both lawyer and police. For the first time, the machinery of justice turned inward, forced to confront its own corruption. For Nicola Gobo, exposure meant the end of everything she had built. The police who once called her brave now saw her as a liability. The criminals she had defended viewed her as a traitor. Her name, once respected in courtrooms, became synonymous with betrayal. She went into hiding, fearing retaliation from the underworld figures she had helped imprison. Living under heavy security, she was effectively exiled from the profession that had once defined her. The life she had sacrificed so much to build now existed only in shadows, haunted by guilt and paranoia. In response to the public outrage, the government established the Royal Commission into the management of police informants. Its purpose was to uncover how such an extraordinary breach of ethics could have gone unchecked for so long. Over 2 years, the commission examined thousands of documents, interviewed police officers, prosecutors, and legal experts, and exposed a system that had chosen expediency over principle. Testimonies revealed a culture within Victoria Police that prized results above the law, where senior officers knowingly authorized the use of a defense lawyer as an informant. Some claimed they believed they were acting for the greater good, that Gobo's intelligence had saved lives and prevented further bloodshed. But the commission saw it differently. The ends did not justify the means. The inquiry painted a damning picture of both Gobo and the police. She had not been coerced into becoming an informant, but neither had she been adequately protected or guided. It was a toxic relationship of mutual exploitation. Gobo sought validation and a sense of purpose, while the police sought control and information. Each side used the other, and in doing so, destroyed the trust that formed the foundation of the justice system. The commission concluded that the actions of Victoria Police had corrupted the criminal justice process and recommended sweeping reforms to prevent such breaches from happening again. For those caught in the fallout, the consequences were immense. Tony Mockbell, still serving his prison sentence, was among the first to challenge his conviction. His lawyers argued that his right to a fair trial had been irreparably compromised by Gobo's secret cooperation with police. Other convicted criminals soon followed, filing appeals that threatened to unravel years of investigative work. Courts began overturning some convictions, acknowledging that the involvement of Gobo as an informant rendered the outcomes unsafe. What had once been hailed as major victories in the fight against organized crime were now being rewritten as miscarriages of justice. The scandal didn't just damage reputations, it shattered public confidence. Ordinary Australians, who had long trusted the courts and the police, began questioning the system itself. How many other informants might have been used in similar ways? How deeply had corruption seeped into the ranks of law enforcement? The revelations forced Victoria Police to issue a rare public apology, acknowledging their failure and the damage done to the justice system. For the officers involved, careers ended in disgrace. For the legal community, it was a reckoning, a painful reminder of how fragile the principles of justice could be when power goes unchecked. Nicola Gobo herself became a recluse. Her public appearances were rare, and her communications with the media came through carefully controlled statements. In interviews, she portrayed herself as a victim, a woman manipulated by a system that used and discarded her. She claimed she had only ever wanted to do the right thing, that her cooperation had been motivated by a desire to protect lives during a violent period in Melbourne's history. But many saw her differently. As a woman who had willingly crossed the line, driven by ambition, ego, and a misguided belief that she could outsmart everyone. Whether she was victim or villain remained a question that divided public opinion. As the Royal Commission concluded its work in 2020, its final report made one thing clear: the damage was irreversible. The justice system would recover, reforms would be implemented, and oversight would be strengthened, but the scars would remain. The Commission's findings prompted changes to how police handle informants, requiring transparency, stricter legal oversight, and an end to any use of lawyers as intelligence sources. It was a necessary correction to a system that had lost its moral compass. In the end, the Lawyer X scandal was not just about Nicola Gobo's betrayal. It was a mirror reflecting the flaws of a system willing to compromise ethics for results. It revealed how ambition, secrecy, and fear can twist even the noblest intentions into corruption. Gobo's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that justice cannot survive when trust is broken at its core. Today, Nicola Gobo lives under protection, her whereabouts undisclosed. Her former clients remain divided between rage and disbelief, and her legacy is one of ruin. A woman who stood at the crossroads of law and crime and chose a path that destroyed both. The scandal she ignited continues to echo through Australia's legal history, a permanent stain on the promise of justice. For the courts, the police, and the people who believed in the system, the lesson is clear. The moment integrity is sacrificed, justice itself becomes the first casualty. A respected lawyer, a trusting client, and a secret worth killing for. The Kamloops murder trial shattered the line between justice and betrayal. As courtroom truths unfold, every revelation exposes how power, greed, and fear can turn a man sworn to protect the law into its deadliest enemy. On a cold March morning in 2022, the city of Kamloops, British Columbia, awoke to headlines that would shatter the calm of its tight-knit community. At the center of the storm was a man known for his sharp intellect and confident courtroom demeanor, lawyer Rogelio Butch Bagabio. To most of his colleagues, he was an articulate and driven legal professional, someone who had spent years earning a name in the corridors of justice. But within weeks, his name would become synonymous with betrayal, deceit, and murder. His alleged victim, 60-year-old Mohammed Abdullah, was not just any client. He was a respected lecturer at Thompson Rivers University, known for his reserved nature and integrity. Their relationship had begun years earlier, rooted in trust and professional reliance. But it would end in a gruesome scene of violence that left the city questioning how far greed could push a man who once swore to uphold the law. Abdullah had come to Canada seeking stability, building a quiet life in Kamloops as a university instructor. His students described him as patient, methodical, and deeply principled. Outside the classroom, he was cautious with money, preferring structured plans over risk. When his marriage began to crumble, he turned to legal assistance to secure his financial future, particularly the large sum of money he had saved over decades of work. In 2016, through mutual acquaintances, he met Bagabio, a lawyer who promised discretion, legal acumen, and absolute protection of his client's interests. Abdullah, cautious but trusting, handed over more than $700,000 to be safeguarded during his divorce proceedings, confident that his funds would be held lawfully until the separation was finalized. For years, their arrangement seemed stable, but as time passed, subtle cracks began to appear. Bagabio's explanations for delayed transfers grew inconsistent. He spoke of tax complications, shell companies, and administrative issues. To Abdullah, these sounded technical enough to believe, at least at first. But behind those excuses, the Crown would later allege, was a web of deception. The once dedicated lawyer had spent large portions of his client's money, weaving financial stories to conceal his growing desperation. As his personal finances collapsed, he began to realize the inevitable. Abdullah would soon demand answers, and the truth would expose him. By early 2022, tension between the two men had escalated. Friends of Abdullah recalled his frustration. He had grown increasingly anxious about the missing funds. expressing doubts about whether Bagabio was being truthful. Text messages showed repeated attempts to arrange a face-to-face meeting, messages that grew sharper and more direct as weeks went by. Finally, a meeting was set for March 11, 2022. It was supposed to be a conversation about resolution, perhaps the return of what was owed. But unbeknownst to Abdullah, his lawyer had already begun to prepare for something far darker. Investigators would later find a handwritten note in Bagabio's residence, a chilling document that prosecutors described as a planning list. The note instructed not to bring a phone, to disable location services, and to bag everything after. It was the kind of evidence that painted a picture of careful, deliberate preparation. According to the Crown, Bagabio had decided that murder was his only escape from exposure. For a man who had spent years understanding the criminal system, his actions seemed disturbingly calculated. The office where he met Abdullah was secluded enough to avoid prying eyes, and the timing, late in the afternoon, ensured minimal traffic in the building. That day, Abdullah walked into the office carrying his briefcase, perhaps expecting a difficult but civil conversation. What followed remains reconstructed largely through forensic evidence, as no one else was present. The Crown's version is chilling. An argument broke out, voices were raised, and in a moment that crossed the point of no return, Bagabio attacked. He stabbed Abdullah multiple times, then used a homemade garrote to ensure his death. Forensic experts later found traces of blood splatter patterns consistent with a violent struggle. The walls bore faint imprints of wiped surfaces, suggesting a hasty cleanup attempt. In the hours that followed, Bagabio began the grim process of concealing what he had done. He wrapped the body in a tarp and secured it with ratchet straps before placing it into a large plastic tote. The tote was heavy, large enough to require significant effort to move. Surveillance footage later captured him carrying it through the office parking area under the cover of night. He placed it in his vehicle, drove home, and for several days, kept the remains stored in his garage while formulating a disposal plan. During this time, he reportedly contacted a neighbor, an unsuspecting acquaintance, asking for help to rent a van, claiming he needed to move office supplies. That van would become the silent witness to his crime. When Abdullah was reported missing by colleagues and family, police initially treated it as a routine missing persons case. But the circumstances quickly turned suspicious. He had missed work without notice, something entirely out of character. His phone was inactive, and his car was still parked near his home. Within days, detectives traced his last known location to Bagabio's office. The lawyer, when first questioned, appeared calm, even cooperative, stating that Abdullah had left after their meeting. His demeanor raised few alarms at first, but inconsistencies in his statements soon surfaced. The turning point came when officers discovered the rented van. Parked quietly near a residential area, it emitted a faint odor that drew immediate attention. Upon opening it, investigators found the plastic tote, sealed, wrapped, and containing the remains of Mohammed Abdullah. The discovery sent shockwaves through Kamloops and across the Canadian legal community. A practicing lawyer, entrusted with the responsibility of upholding justice, was now accused of committing one of the most calculated betrayals imaginable, the murder of his own client. Forensic teams descended on Bagabio's office and residence. Blood traces matched Abdullah's DNA, and the tools recovered, a garrote, knives, straps, and cleaning materials, told a silent but damning story. Among the items seized was that incriminating note, the so-called murder checklist, which prosecutors would later hold up as proof of premeditation. The evidence was overwhelming enough that within weeks, Bagabio was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His law practice was suspended, his license revoked, and his once-respected career reduced to a case study in corruption and moral collapse. As news spread, the community wrestled with disbelief. Students at Thompson Rivers University held vigils in Abdullah's memory, remembering him as a kind educator who had touched many lives. Meanwhile, colleagues in the legal field expressed a mixture of outrage and shame. How could one of their own, a man sworn to ethics and duty, have crossed such a line? For months, media outlets followed every development, piecing together a narrative of trust turned fatal. By late 2023, the case had become one of the most talked-about legal dramas in British Columbia. The courtroom would soon become the stage for a tense battle between Crown and defense, as both sides prepared to argue over the line between deliberate murder and a supposed act of impulsive violence. But beyond the legal definitions, one fact was certain. The bond between client and lawyer, built on faith and confidentiality, had been twisted into a horrifying act of betrayal. The trial that followed would uncover more than a crime. It would reveal the anatomy of deception, the arrogance of intellect gone astray, and the tragic cost of misplaced trust. The next chapter would dive deeper into the evidence, the psychological unraveling of the accused, and the haunting question of whether justice could truly be served when the killer was once its gatekeeper. As the investigation deepened, the truth behind the polished image of Rogelio Butch Bagabio began to erode. Detectives, forensic analysts, and financial investigators collectively unraveled the life of a man who had built his reputation on the very system he now stood accused of betraying. The picture that emerged was one of quiet desperation masked by confidence. A man drowning in financial pressure, personal decline, and ethical decay. Once respected in Kamloops' small but active legal circle, Bagabio had developed a reputation for being meticulous, persuasive, and even charming. But beneath that surface lay mounting debts, professional isolation, and what investigators believed was a growing obsession with control. The Crown later argued that his motive was not only money but also the fear of humiliation, the terror of losing the image he had spent decades crafting. The months following Abdullah's death turned into a marathon of forensic work. The evidence gathered from the rented van and Bagabio's home was methodically processed, with every fiber, fingerprint, and trace sample analyzed. The large plastic tote, sealed with layers of duct tape, bore traces of both men's DNA. Inside were ratchet straps used to restrain the body, blood-stained cloths, and remnants of plastic sheeting, details that would become crucial in demonstrating premeditation. At his office, investigators found cleaning supplies that had been recently purchased, along with a small blood spatter pattern that had been partially wiped from the carpet near his desk. Under ultraviolet light, traces of Abdullah's blood illuminated across the room, a silent testimony to what had taken place there. The handwritten note found in Bagabio's residence quickly became the prosecution's most powerful piece of evidence. The words were scrawled in pen, not typed, a mistake that left his handwriting unmistakably identifiable. It read like a chilling instruction manual. No phone, no watch, disable GPS bag everything after. No trace. Prosecutors argued this was proof of calculation, that Bagabio knew what he was about to do, and took deliberate steps to conceal it. The defense, however, countered that the note reflected anxiety and paranoia, not a concrete murder plan. They claimed it showed a man spiraling into confusion, someone who had intended only a confrontation, not a killing. Financial records added another layer to the case. Through bank statements and transaction trails, investigators traced Abdullah's missing funds. Much of it had been redirected to accounts and expenses tied directly to Bagabio: mortgage payments, personal loans, and unexplained withdrawals. There were also indications of attempts to cover his tracks, including falsified documentation claiming the funds were held in temporary holding companies. For the Crown, this painted a clear picture. Bagabio had misappropriated the money and, when cornered, decided that murder was his only escape. The trial began in 2025 at the British Columbia Supreme Court, with Justice Kathleen Kerr presiding. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of both families. It was a judge-alone trial, no jury, which meant that every piece of testimony, every photograph, and every cross-examination would be weighed solely by the experienced eye of the judge. The Crown's lead prosecutor, and Katrine Settler, opened with a statement that set the tone for the months to follow. She described the crime as a betrayal of the highest order, a lawyer who turned the tools of his trade into instruments of death. Her voice, calm but unrelenting, echoed through the courtroom as she recounted the chain of evidence, from the planning note to the van, to the cold precision with which the body was hidden. Throughout the proceedings, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution called in forensic pathologists who described, in painful detail, the injuries found on Abdullah's body: multiple stab wounds, deep marks consistent with a garrote, and evidence suggesting he had been attacked from behind. They testified that the positioning of the wounds and the cleanup pattern indicated premeditation, not a spontaneous act. Crime scene analysts followed, mapping the movement of blood droplets, the timeline of cleaning, and the likely sequence of events inside the office. Their technical testimony gave structure to what had once been speculation. The defense, led by lawyer Mark Swartz, took a calculated approach. Swartz did not deny that his client killed Abdullah. That much was clear and admitted. Instead, his focus was on intent. He argued that while the act was violent and tragic, it was born from a moment of panic and loss of control, not premeditated murder. Swartz portrayed Bagabillo as a man who had made catastrophic mistakes, who feared financial ruin and professional disgrace, but who never set out to kill his client. He emphasized that Bagabillo had cooperated with authorities early on, had not fled the province, and had even spoken candidly during initial interviews. To the defense, these were not the actions of a calculated killer, but of a broken man facing the consequences of his own spiraling life. As evidence unfolded, the Crown introduced the testimony of a neighbor, the person whom Bagabillo had asked to help rent the van. The neighbor described him as calm and composed during the request, saying he needed the vehicle to move office furniture. The witness testified that nothing seemed strange until days later when police showed up with a warrant. That testimony, combined with surveillance footage of Bagabillo moving the tote at night, strengthened the prosecution's narrative that the cover-up had been meticulously orchestrated. The courtroom was silent when prosecutors played the police interrogation recordings. In the footage, Bagabillo appeared calm, detached, and eerily rational. He spoke about the meeting with Abdullah as if it were a professional dispute that got out of hand. At one point, he said, he wouldn't listen. He was angry, shouting, "I didn't plan this." But investigators pressed him about the note and the cleaning supplies, pointing out the contradictions. His replies became vague and hesitant, and eventually, he requested to stop the interview. The recording became one of the most discussed moments of the trial, not because of any confession, but because of the controlled composure of a man accused of such brutality. Outside the courtroom, the case stirred passionate debate. Legal experts across Canada analyzed every motion and cross-examination. Was this truly a case of premeditated murder? Or could the defense's argument of impulsive violence hold? The public, meanwhile, saw the trial as a moral reckoning, a reminder that power and trust can be abused even by those sworn to uphold justice. By mid-2025, after weeks of testimony, the trial entered its final phase. The Crown summarized its case with precision, pointing to the convergence of evidence: motive, preparation, concealment, and post-crime behavior. Every action he took before, during, and after this killing, Settler declared, reflects control and calculation. He was not reacting, he was executing a plan. The defense countered with a plea for context, urging the court to consider psychological strain and professional collapse. Swartz argued that Bagabillo's mental state had deteriorated to the point of irrationality, that he acted in fear rather than cold logic. Throughout the trial, Bagabillo remained composed, often expressionless. He never took the stand, a decision that left his true emotions, guilt, defiance, or remorse, locked behind silence. Observers described him as detached, listening intently but rarely reacting, except for occasional notes scribbled on a pad. To many, this calm demeanor was unnerving. To his defense, it was evidence of a man numbed by the weight of his actions. As closing arguments concluded, Justice Kerr reserved her judgment, acknowledging the gravity of what she had heard. The verdict would come later, but by then, the public had already made its own. A lawyer-turned-killer, a client betrayed, and a system forced to look at one of its own in the harshest possible light. Yet beneath the headlines and the legal rhetoric, one haunting question remained: what truly goes through the mind of a man who decides that death is a better solution than the truth? The answer, perhaps, would unfold only in the final chapter, as the court prepared to deliver its judgment and the city of Kamloops awaited justice. The final phase of the trial unfolded under the weight of anticipation that gripped Kamloops and much of British Columbia. Months of evidence, testimony, and speculation had led to this point. A moment when the fate of Rogelio Butch Bagabio would rest in the hands of one judge. Inside the British Columbia Supreme Court, the air was heavy with tension. The courtroom was packed with journalists, law students, and members of both the victims and the accused families. The sight of the once proud lawyer sitting silently in the dock, his suit slightly wrinkled, his eyes fixed forward, seemed to symbolize the collapse of everything he had once represented. He had stood in this very kind of courtroom before, but always on the other side, defending clients, arguing for justice. Now, justice stood against him. In the weeks leading up to the verdict, Justice Kathleen Kerr meticulously reviewed hundreds of pages of evidence and testimony. The legal question at the heart of the case was whether Bagabio's actions on March 11, 2022, were premeditated, a deliberate act of murder, or a spontaneous explosion of violence that could be considered manslaughter. The distinction meant the difference between life imprisonment and a significantly lesser sentence. The defense clung to the argument that the killing, while tragic and brutal, lacked the calculated intent that defines first-degree murder. But the Crown's narrative had been painstakingly built on precision. The note, the financial motive, the cleanup, and the concealment, all pointing to planning, not impulse. As the judgment day approached, the city held its breath. Reporters lined the steps outside the courthouse, microphones ready, while camera flashes reflected off the glass doors. Inside, the courtroom was silent when Justice Kerr entered, her expression calm, composed, and unreadable. She began to read her decision, her words deliberate and unwavering. She recounted the events as they had been proven, the financial deception, the planning note, the violent act, and the concealment. Her voice, though measured, carried the authority of finality. "The evidence presented," she said, "establishes beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Bagabio engaged in a planned and deliberate act resulting in the death of Mr. Mohammed Abdullah. This was not a crime of passion, nor a moment of panic. It was an execution born out of self-preservation and greed." With those words, the courtroom seemed to exhale all at once. Justice Kerr found Rogelio Butch Bagabio guilty of first-degree murder. A murmur swept through the crowd, a mix of relief, sorrow, and disbelief. Bagabio sat motionless, his face unreadable, his hands folded neatly on the table before him. He showed no visible reaction, no outburst or plea. To observers, it was as though the verdict had been accepted as an inevitable conclusion to a path he had long resigned himself to walk. Behind him, members of Abdullah's family wept quietly, clutching each other in the knowledge that, at least in the eyes of the law, justice had been served. In her closing remarks, Justice Kerr spoke not only of the evidence but of the ethical betrayal that had deepened the tragedy. "Mr. Abdullah placed his trust in a man bound by duty to protect him," she said. "Instead, that trust was manipulated and destroyed. This case stands as a grim reminder of how power, when combined with deceit, can lead to unspeakable harm." The sentence was mandatory: life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. For a man in his mid-50s, it was effectively a life term. In the days that followed, the media dissected every aspect of the trial. Headlines across Canada described it as "the lawyer's betrayal," "justice turned inside out," and "the case that shook Kamloops." Legal analysts debated how a professional so familiar with the justice system could descend into such darkness. Some saw it as the ultimate irony, a lawyer undone by the very principles he once defended. Others viewed it as a tragic cautionary tale about moral erosion, greed, and the collapse of conscience. Television specials reconstructed the crime scene, while podcasts revisited court transcripts, analyzing every word of Bagabio's interrogation. Inside prison, reports described Bagabio as quiet, withdrawn, and largely isolated. Former colleagues, when asked about him, spoke with a mix of disbelief and sadness. One senior attorney who had mentored him years earlier told reporters, "He was bright, persuasive, and ambitious. But ambition without integrity is a dangerous thing." Those words echoed what many in Kamloops felt, that this crime was not only about the death of one man but also about the corruption of trust that rippled through an entire community. For the family of Mohammed Abdullah, the verdict brought closure but not peace. His brother, speaking to reporters outside the courthouse, said, "We are thankful for justice, but it doesn't bring him back. My brother trusted that man with everything, his money, his future, and he betrayed that trust in the worst way possible." The statement captured the heart of the tragedy. The destruction of faith between two men whose relationship had begun with mutual respect and ended in unimaginable betrayal. In the aftermath, the Law Society of British Columbia released a statement expressing deep sorrow and condemnation. They called for stricter oversight measures to protect clients and prevent similar ethical collapses in the profession. Within the legal community, the case became a topic of introspection, forcing many lawyers to confront uncomfortable questions about the pressures of money, reputation, and personal failure. Law schools across Canada began referencing the case in lectures on professional ethics, not as a tale of legal complexity but as an example of how moral collapse begins in silence, with small compromises that eventually lead to ruin. Meanwhile, the story continued to haunt Kamloops. The office where the murder occurred was later closed, its windows shuttered, its sign removed. Neighbors still remembered the night of March 11th, the faint smell from the van, and the police cars that had filled the street. For them, it was not a story of legal arguments or forensic details. It was a memory of horror unfolding in their midst. As the years passed, the case remained etched in public memory as one of British Columbia's most disturbing betrayals. Documentaries and investigative reports revisited the timeline, each peeling back new layers of insight into the psychology of the killer. Experts described Bagabio as a man driven by fear of exposure, whose intelligence became his own weapon of destruction. He had believed, perhaps, that he was clever enough to outthink the system he once served. But in the end, that system, flawed though it may be, caught up with him. In a reflective closing scene from one such documentary, the camera panned across the quiet Kamloops courthouse, the same building where Bagabio had once practiced law and where he was ultimately condemned. The narrator's voice lingered on a single line that summarized the story's essence. Justice is built on trust, and when the keeper of that trust becomes the betrayer, the entire foundation trembles. Rogelio Butch Bagabio remains in federal custody, serving his life sentence. He no longer gives interviews, and his silence has only deepened the mystery of what he truly felt in those final moments before taking his client's life. Mohammed Abdullah, remembered by students and friends, is now the symbol of a moral wound that extended far beyond one crime, a reminder of the fragile line between integrity and corruption. The trial may have ended, but its echoes continue in every courtroom, every contract, and every moment where trust is exchanged. It stands as a permanent question whispered within the walls of justice. What happens when the guardian of law decides he is above it?